Auditing Theory, Chapter 5, PSA 320, Materiality in Planning and Performing an Audit. Materiality should be considered by the auditor when determining the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures, and evaluating the effect of misstatements. In evaluating whether the financial statements are prepared in all material respects in accordance with an applicable financial reporting framework, the auditor should assess whether the aggregate or uncorrected misstatements that have been identified during the audit is material. If the auditor concludes that the aggregate of uncorrected misstatements may be material, the auditor needs to consider reducing audit risk by extending audit procedures or requesting management to adjust the financial statements for the misstatements identified. If management refuses to adjust the financial statements and the result of extended audit procedures do not enable the auditor to conclude that the aggregate or uncorrected misstatements is not material, the auditor should consider the appropriate modification to the auditor's report. If the auditor has identified a material misstatement resulting from error, the auditor should communicate the misstatements to the appropriate level of management on a timely basis and consider the need to report it to those charged with governance. Analytical procedures, PSA 520. Analytical procedures means that analysis of significant ratios and trends, including the resulting investigation of fluctuation and relationships that are inconsistent with other relevant information or which deviate from predicted amounts. Analytical procedures include the consideration of comparisons of the entity's financial information with, for example, comparable information for prior periods, anticipated results of the entity such as budgets or forecasts, or expectations of the auditor such as an estimation of depreciation, similar industry information. Analytical procedures should include consideration of relationships among elements of financial information that would be expected to conform to a predictable pattern based on the entity's experience, such as gross margin percentages, between financial information and relevant non-financial information, such as payroll, costs to number of employees. The auditor should apply analytical procedures at the planning stage to assist in understanding the business and in identifying areas of potential risk. Analytical procedures in planning the audit use both financial and non-financial information. The auditor should apply analytical procedures at or near the end of the audit when forming an overall conclusion as to whether the financial statements as a whole are consistent with the auditor's knowledge of the business. An application of analytical procedures is based in the expectation of the relationship among data exists and continuing in the absence of known condition to the contrary. The presence of these relationships provides audit evidence as to the completeness, accuracy, and validity of the data produced by the accounting system. The extent of reliance that the auditor places in the result of analytical procedures depends on the following factors. Number 1, materiality of the items involved. Number 2, other audit procedures directed towards the same audit objectives. Number 3, accuracy with which the expected results of analytical procedures can be predicted. When analytical procedures identify significant fluctuations or relationships that are inconsistent with other relevant information or that deviate from predicted amounts, the auditor should investigate and obtain adequate explanation and appropriate corroborative evidence. The investigation of unusual fluctuation and relationships ordinarily begins with inquiries of management, followed by corroboration of management's responses, and consideration of the need to apply other audit procedures based on the result of such inquiries. If management is unable to provide an explanation, or if the explanation is not considered adequate. PSA 550, Related Parties. Management is responsible for the identification and disclosure of related parties and transactions with such parties. The auditor should perform audit procedures designed to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding the identification and disclosure by management of related parties and the effect of related party transactions that are material to the financial statements. However, an audit cannot be expected to detect all related party transactions. The auditor needs to have sufficient understanding of entity and its environment to enable identification of the events, transactions, and practices that may result in a risk of material misstatements regarding related parties and transactions with such parties. When obtaining an understanding of the entity's internal control, the auditor should consider the adequacy of control activities over the authorization and recording of related party transactions. Next, wait. In examining the identified related party transactions, the auditor should obtain a sufficient appropriate audit evidence as to whether these transactions have been properly recorded and disclosed. The auditor should obtain a written representation from management concerning the completeness of information provided regarding the identification of related parties and the adequacy of related party disclosures in the financial statements. If the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence concerning related parties and transactions with such parties, or concludes that their disclosure in the financial statement is not adequate, the auditor should modify the audit report appropriately. PSA 610, using the work of internal auditors. The external auditor should obtain a sufficient understanding of internal and audit activities to identify and assess the risk of material misstatement of the financial statements and to design and perform further audit procedures. The external auditor should perform an assessment of an internal audit function when internal auditing is irrelevant to the external auditor's risk assessment. When obtaining an understanding and performing a preliminary assessment of internal audit function, the important criteria are organizational status, scope of function, technical competence, due professional care. When planning to use the work of internal auditing, the external auditor will need to consider internal auditing's tentative plan for the period and discuss it as early as the stage as possible. When the work of internal auditing is to be a factor in determining the nature, timing, and extent of the external auditor's procedures, it is desirable to agree in advance the timing of such work, the extent of audit coverage, materiality levels, and proposed methods of sample selection, documentation of the work performed, and review and reporting procedures. Liaison with internal auditing is more effective when meetings are held at appropriate intervals during the period. When the external auditor intends to use specific work of internal auditing, the external auditor should evaluate and perform audit procedures in that work to confirm its adequacy for the external auditor's purposes. The evaluation of specific work of internal auditing involves consideration of the adequacy of the scope of work and related programs and whether the preliminary assessment of the internal auditing remains appropriate. The nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures performed in the specific work of internal auditing will depend on the external auditor's judgment as to the risk of material misstatements of the area concerned and assessment of internal auditing. And final one, the evaluation of the specific work by internal auditing. The external auditor would record conclusions regarding the specific internal auditing work that has been evaluated at the audit procedures performed on the internal auditor's work. PSA 620, using the work of an auditor's expert. Auditor's expert, an individual or organization possessing expertise in field other than accounting or auditing, whose work in that field is used by the auditor to assist the auditor in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. The auditor's expert may assist the auditor in obtaining an understanding of the entity and its environment, including its internal control, identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement, determining and implementing overall responses to assess risk at a financial statement level, designing and performing further audit procedures, evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. When planning to use the work of an auditor's expert, the auditor should evaluate the competence, capability, and objectivity of the auditor's expert. The auditor shall obtain sufficient understanding to the field of the expertise of the auditor's expert to enable the auditor to determine the nature, scope, and objectives of that expert's work for the auditor's purpose, evaluate the adequacy of that work for the auditor's purposes. The auditor shall agree in writing when appropriate on the following matters with the auditor's expert: the nature, scope, and objective of that expert's work, the respective roles and responsibilities of the auditor and that expert, the nature, timing, and extent of communication between the auditor and their expert, including the form of any report to be provided by that expert, the need for the auditor's expert to observe confidentiality requirements. The auditor shall evaluate the adequacy of the auditor's expert's work for the auditor's purposes, including the relevance and reasonableness of that expert's findings or conclusions and their consistency with other audit evidence. If that expert's work involves use of significant assumptions and methods, the relevance and reasonableness of those assumptions and methods in the circumstances. If that expert's work involves the use of source data that is significant to that expert's work, the relevance, completeness, and accuracy of that source data. If the auditor determines that the work of the auditor's expert is not adequate for the auditor's purposes, the auditor shall agree with that expert on the nature and extent of further work to be performed at that expert. Perform additional audit procedures appropriate to the circumstances. The auditor shall not refer to the work of an auditor's expert in an auditor's report containing an unmodified opinion unless required by law or regulation to do so. If the auditor makes reference to the work of an auditor's expert in the auditor's report because such reference is relevant to an understanding of modification to the auditor's opinion, the auditor shall indicate in that auditor's report that such reference does not reduce the auditor's responsibility for that opinion.